So, hello folks, and welcome to episode 126 of Retropower Uncut. And it's just me this week, which is why I'm stood in the unusual surroundings for me of the assembly hall, because my brother is away on holiday this week. So he's over in the States at the moment, having a bit of a road trip and looking at a few cars. He's been to Daytona, and I'm not quite sure where he's headed now, but he's off looking at cars anyway over in the States. So here we're going to start with project E-Type. And there's been progress on a few little fronts on this, as there tends to be at this sort of stage in the assembly shop. Well, there's lots of background processes going on that mean where a bit of design work's happened, and then there's some background processes going on to get the parts prepared for actual installation. A good example of that are two items over the far side that have gone on this week. The washer bottle that we talked about previously when we were musing over what sort of washer bottle it ought to have, that's been fitted. The delay on that was, well, not a delay, but the reason it wasn't fitted before was obviously the final finishing of the bracket. The brackets now come back from Xylan coating. We've probably mentioned that coating before, going off on yet another tangent, but just in case anybody is here who hasn't heard the explanation before, we now use that coating quite a lot. There's a local company, East Midlands Coatings, that we use for that, and it is basically a polyfluorocarbon coating, PTFE type coating, which is sprayed and baked onto the parts. It gives really good corrosion resistance, really nice appearance, and very low build. It can be used on threaded components and that type of thing. It can be used on mechanical interfaces because there's very little build, there's very little surface added to the part. So it's great where powder coat would be too thick and paint would be too thick. And it just has a nice period look to it as well. So we've used that on that bracket. So that bracket's now on, washer bottle's now on. Also parts that were away for Xylan involved on the wiper motor conversion. I think it may have been touched on before, but it's now fitted. The wiper motor, I think it's an Audi A3 wiper motor conversion that we've used to give it a more modern wiper and give us intermittent wipers and etc, and just be a more modern unit and better. So that's now fitted. Again, that was waiting for some parts back from Xylan. There's been some work gone on and then gone away again. In all behind me over there on the back cupboards is all the various bits of tin work that act as the front wheel arch liners. All the crap shields, as we might call them, that stop all the muck being thrown into the engine bay and keep the air in the right places. They've all been fitted to make sure they actually worked and that they didn't need any fettling. I think a few bits of tweaking needed. That's been done so that we could then put a Raptor coating onto those. They're powder coated from the supplier. Powder coatings from parts suppliers are famously variable and usually not great. But more relevantly, we wanted to add some extra protection where the wheel dirt's going to hit them. So we've just abraded the inner the wheel-facing surfaces of those panels, and then coated those with just a black Raptor coating, because the under the sort of the wheel-facing areas we've elected to go for a black coating. So those have now been Raptored black, and they're all waiting refitment now. They've been trial fitted, Raptored, and now they're ready to go on. So that's been done. James has been beavering away in the background on a couple of things. He's been sorting out some details to do with the number plate fitment, because we're changing the type of plate that's being used. But he's also been working particularly on the interior changes. Now, we've mentioned before glove box, dash on the driver's side. And last week you saw the start of him doing the CAD work for the new centre console area. And James is off poorly today. We've the Merry Celeste here. We've got everybody seems to be ill today, but that I've just picked out the 3D printer. He set that printing yesterday just as he was going home, so that's now printed, which is the the mock-up piece printed in PLA. I've not taken all the burrs off the edges, so it is just as it came out of the 3D printer. But that's a billet section which is going to carry the central screen in the centre console, and also have the switch gear in it. and form the upper part, the centre part of the dash basically. That'll have the navigation screen in, and I don't quite, unfortunately Cal deals with all that side of things, so I don't actually know what else goes on that screen. Cal will have explained that already, I'm pretty sure, in a previous episode, but that's the holder. That'll be machined in aluminium. All the other parts are profiled parts from sheet metal, but that part, a bit complicated to fabricate and get exactly symmetrical and perfectly neat. So elected to do that from billet, so that's going to be machined, but for the moment, to enable Jim to get the inside parts all mocked up and check everything fits, he's just done a quick 3D printing PLA just to trial that part, and I can see the brackets he's made for it lying next to it. There's some bits he's profiled out on the plasma and bent up, which are going to mount that into the. There it goes, it's on the floor now. He's profiled some brackets there to bolt all that into the inner dash structure, and then the lower section, I know he's also been drawing up the lower section, which will actually mount to sort of sub-assemble to the bottom of that billet piece as well. So that's been progressing. So yeah, all the things coming slowly together, all falling into place on this. We're still waiting for the transmission. Once we get the transmission, we can get the engine and transmission in. That'll be another nice step forward, and things will really be progressing pretty well then. It's all coming together just nicely and a steady pace. And unusually for us, it's sort of almost a restoration. It isn't just a restoration, but it's quite close to a restoration, which is quite nice to be getting along with, because it's a bit less challenging in the details than some of the other stuff that we're doing, like this, where there's a lot of challenges. Moving on to the Jensen CV8. Bobby's yesterday moved onto this to pick up various work on it. One part of which is perfecting the fit of the carbon body to the inner body stroke chassis structure, the steel structure to the steel to carbon interface, if you like. The body shop guys have got it pretty close, but there was an area around the bulkhead here where we weren't quite happy. There was something not quite sitting right, and we hadn't quite verified what it was. Bobby's pulled everything apart and double checked and found some little gremlins lurking in this front seam, which he's cleaned out, sorted out. There was a couple of bits where it had bridged in the mould, I think, and that had just caused this to lift slightly and not sit quite right. So he's dealt with that. He's trimmed up the B-pillar back edges. There's a couple of areas where bits of the inner B-post were sitting on welds, not quite sitting right. When this was moulded by KS, they didn't have access. It was impossible, basically, to take a mould of the back of the B-post, so that we couldn't replicate the face that this carbon part has to fit against during the moulding process, because in order to do that, we'd have had to have taken the body off. So it would have been incredibly complicated to do it that way. So what we did was we moulded, KS did, was to mould off the front of the B-pillar, the steel part of the B-pillar, and then put an offset in the mould to create a surface to put the carbon face for the back of the B-pillar in the correct plane. The problem with that is it doesn't have the detail on it for the back of the door strikers and various bits of weld and reinforcer that are on the back of that. So that's had to be clearanced out of the way. We knew that was going to be the case. There's a couple of areas where we thought we got enough clearance, we hadn't. So Bobby's been back around that, clearanced all that, got all that pretty good now. He's just put the doors back on, and he's going to start building up the door inners next, and also doing some alignment and location on the rear section of the body, because you will have touched on it before, the return section that mounts basically from the B-post all the way around the back of the car and to the other B-post, that's mounted on a return that has yet to be moulded into this body. So we need to get the body sat exactly level. Now we've got all the front exactly right, and everything's set perfectly where it needs to be. He needs to then get the back set up exactly correct as well. And in order to do that, he's going to make a couple of little screw jacks, just bits of threaded bar with some adjusting nuts on, and some base plates that are solid and won't move, that he can set up in the boot to sit the quarters exactly, so he can adjust the quarter panels to get the levels exactly right. He's going to take laser levels off various parts of the car. It's actually quite difficult with this. None of this car is symmetrical anywhere, and it's really difficult. We've mentioned it before, but it's really difficult to get levels off to get something set. So we've had a little talk through earlier about where we're going to take levels from, do some comparisons, average those levels out, and then use that to set the levels on the back, because it's a bit challenging trying to get all that set up. But Bobby's going to be on with that. And then the next step forward for him on here is going to be working on the bonnet, hinge and catch arrangement, which we're currently looking at a fairly modern BMW arrangement, which he thinks will lend itself to doing this job. I would concur with him, but we'll hold fire on going into too much detail until we've trialled it. But we think it'll work quite well. It's a pair of catches of a modern type that will latch the front of the bonnet, but will enable us to use the original central handle on the original bonnet as the safety catch, as the safety release to finally lift the bonnet. The actual remote, the release will be remote, but the handle, the original Jensen handle, will be the safety release, will be the secondary safety release. And then we're also modifying the hinges and making the hinges a parallel action hinge so that the bonnet swings forward a little as it opens, because there's a clearance issue between the back of the bonnet and the top of the door, which I think originally on the Jensen was overcome with baggy tolerances around this area, and there was quite a big panel gap. If you close up that panel gap, which we have done, the back of the bonnet then interferes with the door. And we don't want to just open up the panel gaps to solve that. So instead of that, we're going to, and the original hinges were basically bits of scrap found on the floor, bolted together, I think. So we're going to actually make a nice bonnet hinge that has a nice appearance and that also enables the bonnet to swing forward as it opens. So re-engineering this goalpost structure at the front and re-engineering the bonnet hinges are the next phase, and that ties into the work on the rear face of the bonnet. Once the rear face of the bonnet is reprofiled to accept those catches, then that can go to, and a couple of other jobs, including the headlamp pods, which is another thing for another day. Once all that's done, then the bonnet can go off to KS for moulding, as a book to KS for moulding. And also Bobby's going to be working on the boot lid, working out the boot hinges. I've said to him to look at the hinges with a sort of view of, well, we don't have to use the Jensen ones. If you don't think they're great, then we'll come up with something else, because they are, again, kind of plucked from somewhere and made to fit rather than really designed. So we're going to actually look at doing a proper job of the boot hinges as well, I think, and make a nicer job of those. So that's where we're at in terms of Jensen. Moving along without dropping down the hole, we'll go to Camaro. I'm going to point from the back, but we're actually talking about the front, but that'll do. The action on this has been at the front end. John has been working on the cooler pack, basically. There was a mock-up radiator made for this at the metalwork stage. However, there's been various panel realignments and adjustments done since then. So we wanted to do a final adjust of that cooler, of the dummy radiator, which has been done. And also, there's another addition that hadn't been borne in mind, I don't believe, at the point that the cooler pack was mocked up for this car, which was that we actually need a reasonably substantial cooler for the hydraulic assistance on it. We are using the GM standard LS3 fitment power steering pump for supplying hydraulic effort, but that's being used not only for the steering but also for the power brakes on this car, and it's recommended to use a reasonable sized cooler for that circuit, because the fluid's being put through quite a lot of work. It's not just a very simple circuit as it would be originally. So we're adding an extra air to oil cooler on the front of the car, so there's a slight revision to the cooler pack to enable that to be fitted. So John's been on with that as well. And also, I think we may have mentioned last week, we were fitting some aftermarket cam covers, valve covers to the engine, which also cover the coil packs, hide the coil packs nicely. We wanted to stick with the original LS3 General Motors coil packs, just because, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And those cam covers were not designed to go with those coils, so there's been a slight modification, just only very minor, but a bit of modification under those under those valve covers, just to enable the standard GM coils to fit in there without any interference with anything. I think that's pretty much, I've probably skimmed over a few details. I'm not completely au fait with every detail of what's been going on, because I haven't really been in here this week very much. There's been a few traumas going on at home this week as well, so I've kind of been in and out a little bit. My son got injured earlier in the week, and I've been in and out a little bit myself as well. So moving on to the Land Cruiser. Bobby's been working on this, unfitting and then refitting the transmission cover and sorting out the electric electrical circuitry and electronics, I suppose, for the transfer case. We mentioned previously we were using, well, you'll have seen in previous episodes, we were using an 80 series Land Cruiser transfer case, and we wanted to try and use, for the sake of keeping the system nice and clean, we decided we were going to use the 80 series Land Cruiser transfer box control relay, if you like. The way it's used in the Land Cruiser 80 series is not quite how we're going to use it in this, but the basics of it's a smart relay, effectively, a programmed relay, and Bobby's wired that in on this. As I say, there's a couple of tweaks being done in its mode of operation, but basically it controls the operation of the centre diff lock. That's pretty much its main operation, is just controlling the centre diff lock, and the relationship of that to the high and low selection. Bobby's also been finishing off the selector cables that go into the two low-car remote selectors for the transfer box range selection and the main auto transmission selector, because we'd had to remove the knobs from those during the metalwork stages, and they're a bit fiddly to put back on, so he's done that. But yeah, he's also done the wiring for the Toyota 80 series Land Cruiser smart relay that controls the diff lock actuator, zeroed the diff lock actuator, worked out the 0 points for the diff lock actuator and the actual diff lock engagement rack, got them set up and got that bolted into the transmission for the final time now. So that's all set up, so that'll operate the diff lock as intended, and we've got a new little button in there that operates that. So that's all now together. I'm sure Bobby had been doing something else on this as well, but I can't remember what, so I'm going to have to leave it at that because I can't remember. I think we've pretty much covered that. I think in here, and another little bit of progress was on the NSU in the background. John's been doing a little bit on that. I think we'd mentioned in previous episodes, there's a local company we use called Brake Caliper Solutions, who've helped us out with a number of parts for the brake calipers on this. We use them quite a bit for rebuilding brake calipers. On this, we've actually rebuilt the brake calipers ourselves for various reasons, but they've helped us out with the parts to do that. We've got that all sorted, and John's finished off getting the calipers rebuilt, and now got the calipers on the rear installed. That's right, isn't it? You've got the calipers on the back of this, isn't he? Yeah. Well, obviously, we can't fit them on the front because they're inboard. But he's got the calipers fitted on the back of this now, and all the calipers rebuilt. We're all happy with those. So that's another step closer to being able to be handed over to the customer, who's, as I mentioned before, he's actually getting that. The final parts are being put together on this car by a guy elsewhere in the UK, who is kind of the UK authority on NSU RO80s, who's got a lot more knowledge than we have on all the final build-up, so he's going to be undertaking all that work. But yeah, the brake calipers being done, complete and rebuilt, was another step closer, because even that task became quite involved. We probably mentioned it in a previous episode, but the specific bolts for those calipers aren't available. They're quite oddball sizes. I think they're M7 and M9 bolts, so they're not greatly available. And then they also have a particular head profile, and if you use a different head profile, it's not suitable. Basically, it'll foul the wheel. And there's a lot of complicating factors involved just in finding some bolts to hold the brake calipers together. And things like the seals that go between the caliper halves are quite specific as well, and they look interchangeable with others, but they're not quite. Load of little details that just hold the process up, but that's all back together now. I think at that point, we'll probably round off assembly shop for the week, and we'll wander through to fabrication land, where the major thing is the big push to get the Ford Escorts finally finished, and we're getting pretty close. Hi, Sam. We're on the big push to get these done. Sam's pushing ahead with getting as much as possible tied down and finished off on this, but he's also helping Tom get finished on the Project 1 Escort, because we're trying to get that one pushed through. The plan was to get it through to blasting and zinc metal spraying the end of this week. It's now going to be next week because we've hit a couple of little stumbling blocks that have slowed us down a bit, but it is progressing quite well. As I say, Sam's been working on this. At the moment, literally now, he's doing the modified anti-roll bar brackets for the front, which double as an anti-roll bar bracket to carry the aftermarket Rix engineering anti-roll bar, but they also double as a mounting for the dry sump tank on one side, and we've modified how they engage with the front panel because we've rebuilt the entire front panel. So he's rebuilding the anti-roll bar mounts to the new sort of design for that. He's also been getting all the panel fit finalised on the front. That's all pretty close now, and then working on just tidying up and titivating the inner front panel structure. And he's also made all the mountings brackets for the air conditioning condenser unit and the dryer, the air conditioning dryer unit, both of which sit in the front panel area, and then making sure that they all still fit within the front panel because it's all extremely tight in there. And he's also made the unions, because we had to custom make 2 unions from cut up parts of other I forgot the manufacturer of the unions that we use, Burgerflex. The Burgerflex sourced unions that we use for the Burgerflex UK, that we use for the unions for the air conditioning units. They don't make a union that basically fits in the space that we need it to. If we had a CNC tube bender and were manufacturers of air conditioning tubing parts, we could probably make some mandrel bent tube parts to do it. As it is, considering we've only got to make 2 sets, we've done them by TIG brazing 2 unions together, which Sam's done. Sam's brazed those unions together and now got those so they all fit in the space in the front. Bobby did a set for the other car, and Sam's now got the ones done for this car to do the same job. I think there's one more part he needs to make, which is the union that goes onto the compressor unit, which was done from a machine part, but that's to come. As I say, Sam's I'm trying to get the most progress done on the other car so we can get that one finished first. Then this car will go to where that one is, so we'll move on to that now, well, via a couple of others on the way. The Redux E30 is sitting here on its trolley at the minute. That is about to go onto the rotisserie. It would be on the rotisserie today, but Scott's not here because he's ill, so that one's parked there. As soon as Scott's back, hopefully tomorrow, then that might get onto the rotisserie, because that's the next step on that, is finishing all the seam brazing work that couldn't be done with it on the jig. So that'll be carrying on with seam brazing on that, plus a couple of little bits of finishing off and trial fitting. That's currently awaiting a couple of 3D printed trial parts from George upstairs. Once Scott's got those, he'll do a bit of trial fitting of a couple of parts. We're using 3D printed models just to test that they do fit in the space we think they fit into. But that's progressing along there. I've now got to remember everything that's going on this, because Stu's picking up a huge variety of tasks on Project Churchill. Cal sat down, I think I mentioned this the other week, last week, week before, I lose track now, and did a sort of first listing of all the major outstanding tasks, which I think was about 76 items on this. I sat down with Stu for half an hour yesterday and went through and refined that list down into what can be done on the jig, what can be done on a rotisserie, what can be done on a lift, and all the various stages of those jobs. But in the meantime, Stu has been getting on with the handbrake mechanism. I think the original plan was to use an electric handbrake on this. There was a slight revision to plans, and it's now a mechanical handbrake. We've elected to use the original Mark II type setup because it actually fits really quite nicely, and we fitted that in the original Mark II type location using the original transfer shaft across and the original bell crank on the other end of that shaft. Stu's made all that fitted the bearing on the other end, done the cutouts in the seat frame for that shaft to pass through. And then we've identified and sourced a micro switch to use for the handbrake warning switch, and come up with a nifty little way of mounting that off the inside face of the seat mountings, and welding a little cam section onto the cross shaft to operate that micro switch. So that's all done. And Stu's now on with doing the mock-up of all the detail work to do with the HVAC unit. You remember before that he'd done a basic mock-up with the HVAC to actually make the brackets to fit it and get it in situ behind the dash, but he's now working on getting all of the duct work in and all of the detail work to do with this sort of stuff to get everything in under the dash, get all the vents piped up, get the air all talking with all the other bits that need feeding with air, and getting all of that in the space available, which is not an awful lot. He's also got the 3D printed. I think it'll have been mentioned in previous episodes, but for doing all the dummy build mock-up stage work with ECUs and any other boxes of electronics basically that we use, in which principally these days are an engine ECU, a power distribution unit, PDM, PDU, whatever you would like to call it, and then possibly a slave PDU depending on how many channels we use. In this car, for example, we're using an ECU master main engine ECU and an ECU master 16 channel PDU, and then a slave ECU master 16 channel PDU, because we need more than 16 channels. I don't exactly know how many we need, but more than 16. So we've got 2 of those units. They're all linked on CAN bus, so they're nice and easier from a wiring point of view. But we've got to get those located, and you don't really want to be using the actual final units in the car during the mock-up stages, get them all full of metal, dust and grit. So we've actually got some 3D printed units that James did the other week, and Stu's got those 3D printed PDUs and ECU, and he's going to be making the mountings behind the dash for that. But that's why he's moved on to putting the HVAC in, because they actually sit very near to where the HVAC's sitting, and he's got to make sure there's space for all the parts in the space and still be able to get the plugs on and off everything, still be able to get the pipe work in and all the duct work in, so it's just making room for all that. He's also doing the cutouts in the bulkhead for the wiring looms to go through into the engine bay, the various sections of wiring to go through into the engine bay. And again, using the 3D printed parts, we have the plug profiles for the engine ECU plugs, so you can do the grommeted, the cutouts for the grommets in the bulkhead, the correct size to be able to get the engine ECU plugs through, but not excessively large. So again, that's another stage he's at on that. And then the other section that he's been on with, but there won't be an awful lot on camera for it because there's been more head scratching than anything, is sorting out the oil cooler for the transmission on the front, where to put it. We've kind of decided where that's going this morning, spec the cooler, worked out the size that the cooler's got to be to fit in the space, how it's going to get mounted, how the pipe work's going to run. So Stu's been working on that this morning. And I lose track. I think that's probably the bulk of progress on that. In the background, still ongoing, is the engineering work on the rear suspension that was mentioned before. That's bobbing along in the background because CAD time is, George's CAD time split in a lot of directions at the moment, and one of his jobs is drawing up the parts for that. But I know that's been pushed onto the back burner a little bit by a couple of other jobs that have leapfrogged it a bit, so he's juggling tasks a bit at the moment, so that's just being held up by that. In the scheme of the events on the car, it's really not a problem because there's a lot of other jobs needed to run in parallel with that, so that's fine. That'll just keep bobbing along in the background. I think that pretty much sums up where we're at. I'm sure I'll have missed something, but that pretty much sums up where we're at on that. And then moving on to project 1, I'll come over here. Progress on various fronts on this. Tom's working on, again, as we will have been doing for a while, getting all the panel fits up to scratch on it. There's quite a bit of work involved in just getting the door gaps all good, the door to sill good, the door to B-post good, the door frame good, and then we've got to do the lead work on the scuttle and get all that to fit the wings and everything else. He's been working on the wing top flanges, getting those to shape, getting the wing to front valance to be good. He's got the front panel, the slam panel all spot welded in place now. I don't know if that was on last week or not. I don't think it was actually. So he's got the slam panel all spot welded in place now. Basically the front panel fit up is all really good now. That is all very, very close to bang on. We're on the brink of doing the lead work, but we need to be able to really, before we put it on the rotisserie, we need the rotisserie mounts making, which is going on now. I drew up some bits just a bit earlier today to be able to mount this. So we've got we're running the rotisserie mount through the headlamp holes because we haven't got any bumper mount holes to mount. We'd normally use rotisserie mounts that go through and pick up off the original bumper mounts and go through the holes in the front panel where those bumper mounts were. We haven't got them on this car anymore because that's not how it's been fitted. So I've just started sort of working out how we're going to mount it, come up with a bit of an idea. And then I've just handed over to Sam, cut some bits out on the plasma earlier, and he's just getting those fabricated and welded together. Then we're also going to revise how we mount the car at the back as well to the rotisserie. We normally mount off the rear panel where the bumper mounts are. It has a tendency to flex the rear panel a bit and create more work in the body shop. It can pull the panel slightly, so we're actually going to mount from the rear panel still, but also off the rear leaf spring shackle mounts in the chassis rails. I'm going to put a big pin through that and then bolt to that as well, just to hang the back of the car off that. And then really the next stage is get it on the rotisserie and get the lead work done, and get all the seam brazing finished underneath. And there's quite a lot of weld finishing, you know, just looking now I can see the compression strut brackets are tacked on but need fully welding. There's various areas where we need to just do finish welding underneath and finishing off and tidying underneath. But it's very, very close to the stage where it will be in body prep. I'd say hopefully by this time next week it should be blasted and zinc metal sprayed. I'm putting things on the line saying that because there's bound to be, the nearer you get to the finish line, the more little problems you come up against in getting there. We had a little tweak to do on the front wings at the beginning of this week, where we actually had, because we hadn't fully modelled everything on the front of the car through lock to lock. We'd model it with the wheels on, with the wings on, but we hadn't been able to put everything through lock in the CAD. Because it's just very difficult to do basically with a basic scan unless you're drawing the entire car from scratch. And we actually had a foul condition between the tyre and the very bottom corner of the wing here on lock, on full droop and on lock. And we want to make sure we've got clearance throughout, so we've actually had to reprofile just this lower section of the wing here. We've actually taken a small sliver out and just moved this line forward slightly. It actually flows really well still, but we've just had to move that forward very slightly down there because we just had a foul condition we didn't anticipate down there, just to show where things can go wrong. And another area that's absorbed time is that the wing, again, the panel quality it's very close, but there are areas where it's not good enough. And obviously on a car where it's got to be perfect, there was extra work needed, and this corner of this wing was not really right. So Tom spent quite a bit of time getting all this very close to shape, but we're going to have to just put a tiny bit of lead in the very front of there just to get that to look exactly right, because the front of this wing is just not quite right on that corner. The line is actually slightly too far back. So we've just had to do a little edit of the front of that, and then in doing, we're just going to need a little skim of lead in there just to get that exactly right. But yeah, extremely close. As soon as we can get it mounted onto the rotisserie, it'll be pretty much all where it needs to be at, and hopefully then straight into body prep, and we can get on with that. In terms of the body prep, the guys are basically mopping up lots of other smaller jobs that have been going on in the background, which we probably don't have a lot of footage of. They've been carrying on with getting the bonnet and boot ready for the Escorts, ready for taking the moulds off those. There was a bit of a hole that we had to do a couple of little corrections on the bonnet. It had been put down on its back edges, not by us, but in the past it had been put down on its back edges and dragged a bit, and one of the back corners wasn't quite right, so we built that up with a little bit of TIG braze and then sanded that to shape. And then they had we touched on it before, but they've got a bit of crusty and rustiness on the back of the boot lid, which needed smoothing out just to be able to get a clean mould off that. So they've been doing that and then picking up various other jobs, sort of the parts painting and general sort of sorting out of bits and bobs in the background that have been on the back burner for a while that they've been catching up with. And that pretty much, I think, sums up everything with where we're at in the fabrication shop. And just wondering, it's the Escort bonnet, funnily enough. Just heard the booth click on in the background. It's the Escort sort of book bonnet that will be going to KS Composites that's actually in the booth at the moment, and that'll be getting a healthy coat of polyester spray surfacer to get the build on that's needed. So that's in there now, getting it spray surfacer. So yeah, I think that's pretty much where we're at in the dirty side of Retropower. And on that note, I think we'll see you again in a week's time.